Hey guys, this is Strength Coach Friedman with the Strength Coach Friedman Podcast, and today I'm going to be having a conversation with a good friend of mine, Louie Scorzello, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about misconceptions in strength and conditioning and the fitness industry. So to give you a little background on Louie real quick, Louie has a master's in strength and conditioning. There's only about 3 schools in the country right now that actually have a master's in strength and conditioning, so it's pretty cool. I actually got to take some classes with Louie, and we were at school together. And he's also a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and he's also a certified personal trainer through the American College of Sports Medicine, like myself. So, Louie, I know we've had so many chats on strength and conditioning before. We've logged a lot of hours talking about these things. And we've been talking about doing a podcast forever, so it's great we can finally sit down and knock this out. So we were going to talk about a little bit of some misconceptions, things that people kind of misunderstand about what strength and conditioning is or how things operate. So I wanted to talk about something we've talked about many times before, and we kind of, in the strength and conditioning world, we call it ex-athlete syndrome, which pretty much refers to the idea of people thinking that just because you're an athlete means you're automatically qualified to be a strength and conditioning coach. Now, I just want to point out there are many athletes out there who have made the switch to being a strength and conditioning coach after their athletic career, and they've done an excellent job. However, there are plenty of athletes out there who haven't made that switch. So they just kind of jumped into the role of a strength and conditioning coach and just tried to kind of fly by the seat of their pants with only the knowledge they acquired from being an athlete. So Louie, what are your thoughts on this, and what have you seen in the industry, and do you think this is kind of holding the industry back?
Well, first off, I want to thank you, Mark, for having me on the show.
Oh, it's great to have you, Lou.
I might be one of your first guests.
You are. You're my first guest.
It's a pleasure. Hello, everybody listening. Now, to go to your question, I've had the opportunity and the fortune to work with a number of strength and conditioning coaches in the collegiate setting. And something that I've seen throughout my career is this pattern where many athletes who graduate from the school or play professionally and no longer have a career in athletics transition to strength and conditioning, but without requisite education in the field of strength and conditioning. Mm-hmm. So what you end up seeing a lot of times in the field are industry professionals who are simply mirroring what their predecessors did. They take ideas from the type of training that they themselves participated in when they were in their high school career, in their collegiate career, in their professional career possibly, and they use those same strategies with the next generation of athletes. Now, there's 2 sides to this. The first side is it's great that a lot of the old school training methods are not being lost. Stuff that was kind of formulated 50, 60 years ago is still being used, and a lot of that stuff has great merit. The problem, though, is that when you're simply mirroring what your predecessors did in the past, you're not taking in the latest in research, the latest in teachings, and essentially the latest concepts in strength and conditioning that in a lot of ways are becoming superior to the older methods. And the reason this is happening is because the selection process for strength and conditioning coaches is far more skewed towards the ex-athlete than towards the scholar who has spent their time and their education and their career learning about the field, learning about the science behind the training, and then applying that with their athletes. So it's becoming a bit of a loop where information is propagated from one coach to the next coach to the next coach without that scholarly influence. Does that make any sense?
Makes a lot of sense, Louie. It sounds almost like you're describing the game of telephone. And that's a game that we used to play back in kindergarten where we'd line up 20 kids, the teacher would start a phrase, and we'd have to pass that information from one person to the next. And by the end of the line, the information was very skewed. The sentence that was, Mary buys pumpkin pies at the deli becomes something like, Fred brought his dog to the vet. So I can definitely see how, unfortunately, over the course of time, if you're simply passing on information without understanding why you're doing what you're doing, that information can kind of get a little bit shuffled over the course of time. And, I've heard coaches say things like, I've been doing this for 20 years. It worked then, it works now. And in some instances, that could be great. But then, if you look at most of the modern things in our lives today, are you driving the same car for 20 years ago? Are you using the same phone from 20 years ago? What about the same computer? So as much as I believe in these old school methods, I'm a big fan of methods that date back thousands of years, things back to the ancient Egyptians, people that were ancient Indonesians, ancient Greeks and Romans. There were a lot of excellent training methods that I think they did much better back then than we even do today. However, along the line, I think some training methods get a little bit distorted, and I think every so often we need to kind of reevaluate what we're doing. My philosophy in training is you should never just do something to do it. All right? If you saw something on YouTube and it looks cool, or simply because your coach had you do it previously, it doesn't mean that you should necessarily do it. And this is for a variety of reasons. One, your athletes might not be you. Different age, different background, different sport, whatever it is, might not be exactly what they need. And secondly, you should always have purpose. What is the purpose behind your training? Always ask yourself, always question your own training methods. That's something I always talk about with friends and athletes that I've worked with. Question what you're doing. The second you stop questioning yourself and just think whatever you're doing is automatically and inherently correct, that's when you're going to lose yourself. That's when you get stuck in a rut, and that's when you're going to stop growing as a coach and a trainer. So always kind of check in on yourself, see what you're doing, what you're thinking, and ask yourself, take a step back and evaluate it objectively. Why am I doing this, and is this really what I need to be doing?
I do this a lot now with my clients. I work with a number of clients in the private sector, and in the recent past, I've also been a teacher. And something I tell every client, and I told my students, was that if we're doing something, whether it's an exercise, whether we're going over a concept, and you ask me why we're doing this, what's the purpose of what we're doing, and I can't answer you, you don't have to do it. Because that's a neglect of me. That I'm giving you something that I don't understand. So that's the first thing that I think all personal trainers and strength coaches should try to realize, is that everything that you do in the course of a session, in a week, in a month, in a year, has to have purpose. And if it doesn't have purpose, throw it out. If you don't know why it has purpose or what the purpose is, then that's your onus to find out. As far as what we were just talking about with coaches using, let's say, older strategies, one of the problems is that everything works. But what does that mean, everything works? Well, any exercise produces a response. Any food that you put in your body produces a response. But in strength and conditioning, we're dealing with the highest levels of athleticism. The scouting reports and the process by which these athletes are picked to perform in these sports, we're getting the elite of the elite. So something could work, but something else could work a lot better. And
Absolutely.
We're dealing with fine margins. Look at the difference between the first place runner and the 10th place runner in the 100-meter final of the Olympics. We're talking about tenths of a second.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a number of exercises and a number of workouts that work but don't work as well as something else, that could be the difference. It's not this person is faster than the other. It could be, but it could be that this person's using strategies that produce just a tenth of a second of difference, but that's all the difference in sports.
Absolutely. In sports, it really comes down to those fine little things sometimes. Were you able to keep your foot in bounds when you were making the catch? And that really comes down to the training. Absolutely, there's a huge genetic component, which we've discussed many times before. Some athletes just have just the very makeup and structure of their body, the way everything operates is going to be a huge factor as well. But yes, the finesse, the finessing of an athlete. When you're a coach, I kind of think of it as you're the mechanic. You got to keep that vehicle tuned up. You got to keep your athlete well tuned, well functioning, and operating to the nth degree. So I think that's definitely a key factor. Another issue that I've kind of dealt with, tying into the perceptions of of head coaches of strength and conditioning coaches, is that many head coaches specifically want a strength and conditioning coach who was a former athlete of that sport. I know I applied for a job a while back to work as a strength and conditioning coach for a swim team. And I had spoken with the head coach of the team, and they actually, by the time I had gotten to speak to her, they'd already hired someone. But she specifically mentioned that she had hired an individual who was previously a D1 swimmer. So, Louie, what are your thoughts on that? I tend to think the head coach is already the expert on the sport, and many times it's good to have a head coach who knows the sport very well. But do you think simply having an ex-athlete be the strength and conditioning coach for a sport is always ideal?
Well, I believe that issue plays into the structure of the way most athletic departments are run. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on head coaches, especially the higher up you go.
Absolutely.
Look at the amount of firings that happen in collegiate and professional sports. So from their perspective, I understand the want and desire to control everything that the athletes that you're recruiting are doing. So what that leads to, unfortunately, is sometimes the head coach who has no background in strength and conditioning at all, or training, that has never trained anybody in the gym, is trying to impart their own misguided philosophy on their athletes. I'll say this, and I'll give an example that's much more practical. So I worked with a basketball team, and the head coach was a big believer in the bench press exercise. Why? I could not tell you, but he was a big proponent of heavy bench pressing. What were all the athletes doing? Heavy bench pressing. I talked to the strength coach and I said, why are the athletes doing all this heavy bench pressing? And he told me, well, I want to keep my job, and this is what the head coach wants. These are his players, so that's what has to be done. And I totally respect that, but I believe it's an unfortunate situation for the strength coach.
And for the athletes.
Absolutely. The athletes are being compromised. They're being placed at a great risk. Mm-hmm. When you're doing heavy 90% of 1RM loads in season, there could be a reason, like we talked about, there could be a purpose, but typically that's not something that's recommended because of the risk. There's a risk of injury there, and to be placing the athletes in that risk for a strength coach who knows that's not the best way to go about it to fulfill the head coach's wishes seems a bit misguided, but it happens quite frequently, I imagine.
Yeah, I've heard many incidents of that as well. It's interesting because you really think about it. How heavy is basketball? Basketball really isn't that heavy. So to having to be doing, benching several hundred pounds to try to, shoot that basketball a little bit further. I think most collegiate level athletes, collegiate level basketball players have enough strength that they can pass the ball to their fellow teammates, and they could shoot it far enough to get it to the basket. They don't need to be throwing. This isn't the shot put. They're not trying to send that ball as far as they possibly can. That's not the game of basketball. So it's just kind of interesting sometimes how head coaches unfortunately get certain ideas kind of caught in their heads, and they just think that that's going to be what the athlete needs. In the instance of swimming, I think there's a lot of great strength and conditioning movements that can be done to improve a swimmer. I wasn't a collegiate swimmer, but I know about the movements of swimming, so I can easily put together a training program that would, and I've worked with various swimmers when I was training, and I was very quickly and very easily able to help them get over swimming injuries and pain that they were developing from doing what their coaches were having them do. I actually had this was a high school swimmer who was actually working with me, and she was having these shoulder problems. She brought a whole chunk of my training program to her team. So when she was warming up her team as the captain of her team, she was instilling all these methods, and not only her, but now the rest of the team were having relief and experiencing more fluidity with their strokes in the water. So things like this are I think, really important for head coaches to consider when training or when selecting the strength and conditioning coach they're going to be working with. Granted, they don't always have the call, depending on how the school works and how everything's orchestrated. But I think it's important to remember that a good strength and conditioning coach, and good is very subjective, but I think a strength and conditioning coach that really knows their stuff, that knows strength and conditioning, is unlimited by the sport. So what I mean by that is, if a strength and conditioning coach really understands the principles of training, they should be able to train any kind of athlete. You could take me, drop me on an alien planet in a sport that I've never even heard of or seen. Give me some time to watch those athletes. Let me watch the games. Let me watch how they move, okay? And if I can then understand the movements behind the game and what are the limiting factors of the sport, I could design a training program that I think would benefit those athletes. So it's important to think of things, just because a strength and conditioning coach didn't play a particular sport, if they understand strength and conditioning, that shouldn't limit them in their ability to train an athlete. Now, I'm not saying they should be the head coach. Don't make me the head coach of a swim team. That's no good. But in terms of being able to provide the strength and conditioning to, again, help the athlete, because you got to remember, what are the two main factors, the two main things that a strength coach has to do? Their jobs are to minimize risk of injury of the athlete and improve performance. And as long as you understand, again, the movements of the sport and the ways to prevent injuries in those sports by understanding the movements, a strength coach can do a great job working with any athlete.
The area you just talked about is one of the best ways that we can explain tying in the science of training with its application. So when we're watching a sport as a strength coach, and we're analyzing the sport, we're not watching it the way a fan would watch it. We're not watching the ball and did the person throw a touchdown, or did they shoot the three-pointer and make it or miss it? That's not what we're looking for. We're looking at the patterns of movement, for one.
Absolutely.
So we're watching which planes of motion is the sport primarily taking place in. For instance, we look at tennis. Tennis is a lot of frontal plane motion. Now, when the athlete is sprinting for a ball that might be out of their natural reach, we see transverse motion. So that's something we're watching. Then we look at that, and that's data that we're inputting in our head. And we're saying, based on these patterns that we're observing, what are the types of exercises that would best elicit the strength and power in those patterns, but more importantly, efficiency in those patterns? Because remember, the more efficient that the athlete can move in the patterns that's necessary for the sport, the less energy they're wasting, and therefore, when that fourth quarter comes around, they're fresher. And when you're fresher, you're faster. Because the other guy that is guarding you, if it's a team sport or offense-defense kind of thing, they're tired because they've burned more energy because their training methods are not producing that efficiency. Also, we look at the time continuum of the sport. So let's use hockey as an example. Hockey players are rotated in and out 45 seconds to a minute per play, essentially. So the energy systems, that anaerobic glycolysis that's going on there in those systems, that's the kind of process that we have to train. So when we're conditioning athletes in the gym, we have to condition them primarily in the energy system that they're using on the field. So having a hockey player run 5 miles is not, it might help, it might work, but it's not working as well as conditioning that's specific to the athlete's need. And remember, we're talking about inches here. This isn't something that's just thrown out to the wind. These are specific measurables that we can look at and say, what's the best way to approach the situation?
Yeah, far too often do people kind of misuse, do coaches, head coaches, strength coaches, and even personal trainers, they misuse the information that is yielded from some of these exercise physiology papers. And I think this is a good example of that. Sometimes coaches, I've heard coaches say things like, oh yeah, I have my baseball players run 3 miles a day. Well, that's completely looking at the oxidative energy system when you're doing 3-mile runs, and yet baseball is one of the most purely phosphagen energy system based sports, where everything is sport, explosive movements, swinging a bat, throwing a ball, making a quick play. Plays only last a few seconds in baseball, yet we're training athletes now to train for a longer span of time, which will actually diminish their ability to move and act explosively. So unfortunately, there was a whole time, this probably goes back about 20 or so years ago, when the exercise physiology movement was talking a lot about VO2 max and aerobic capacity. It kind of got, they're doing a lot of research, but some of this research, the results were being misapplied. So you had a lot of coaches that were taking their athletes and having them do way too much aerobic conditioning. So you have football players running a few miles at a time. Football is a sprint-dominated sport. Again, very much phosphagen energy system based, phosphagen, fast glycolysis, and this starts to kind of actually diminish the athlete. This actually can hurt the athlete. And I believe Andre Agassi actually talked about this in his book a little bit, how he had a coach that was just misconditioning him, and then once he made the change, he actually started to see a lot of improvement. A funny story, I was at a conference probably about 6-7 months ago, and it was a nutrition conference actually. You had 2 individuals there that were speaking. It was Nancy Clark, who wrote Nancy Clark's Sport Nutrition Guidebook, and there was also an exercise physiologist by the name of John Ivey. Brilliant guy, really, really great guy. I got to sit and actually chat with him for a little bit at the end. Extremely knowledgeable, and his lab's been behind some of the big exercise physiology concepts. The idea of sport nutrition and nutrition timing. He actually wrote the book Nutrition Timing. In addition, he did all the research talking about chocolate milk being a good supplement. So he's done a lot of great stuff. But he was explaining how he had done a research project at one of the schools he was working at, where they took the basketball team, and these guys, were jumping pretty high. They had I don't remember the exact numbers, but their vertical jumps were pretty good. And they did a program where they had them do aerobic training. Okay, they stopped doing their jump training and more explosive-based stuff. They started doing aerobic training for about 8 weeks, and at the end of the 8 weeks, they retested their vertical jump. The vertical jumps were cut in half. So within 8 weeks, they essentially destroyed these athletes' ability to jump vertically. Now they were able to build it back, of course, but that just goes to show the importance of the right type of conditioning. And this is an issue when I was working for the United States military. This was a huge issue. The PT test, the physical training test that the soldiers in the military are supposed to undergo, for the Army, it's 2 miles. Each branch has a long run. Navy does 1.5 miles, etc., but it's all between 1.5 and 3 miles, depending on the branch. But this is all aerobic training. And if you actually talk to a soldier, and I've spoke to a lot of soldiers that I've trained, they've never had to go for a run. They never put on PT gear, a pair of sneakers, and go for a run at a steady pace through the desert. It just doesn't happen. Most gunfights, usually last on average around 45 seconds. So the type of training that the military is ultimately asking these tactical athletes to do is very far off from what they actually need in the field. Most of the athletes that I've spoken to, tactical athletes, they have to sprint the length of a Humvee. It's a quick dash to get out of the line of fire or to make an approach on the enemy. So, it's just another time where back in the day there was this misused information. Maybe the research itself was good, maybe not, but whoever took the information misunderstood it, misapplied it, and it's created these long-lasting problems. And then tying back in what we talked about earlier about the idea of information, rather than people stopping to look at things for themselves and do some research, simply doing what they did before, this is how we fall into these trends. So you get some bad information, you get some bad training, or I don't like to say bad training, ineffective and detrimental training. That gets mixed into the flow, and now this starts getting repeated and taught to the future generations.
I agree 100%. It's a real shame because research is a great thing, but it could also be, like you said, misapplied. And sometimes the research itself is flawed. And people in the know draw conclusions based on research that might not have really been validated as far as the testing methods, the control groups that were used. So that's one problem, is it's just the research itself. But then I believe a bigger problem is a general trend of coaches in the field not appreciating the information that's coming out because they're so instilled. It's so instilled in them, the methods that they've done themselves.
And it's culture.
It's culture.
It's they say culture is the, sorry to cut you off there, Louie, but they say culture literally has to do with the information that is passed down from generation to generation. And the military culture was so strong that people were so set in their mindset, it was very hard to convince the people I work with otherwise. And we see the same thing within the training culture, within these sport cultures. This is how it's done. This is how we've always done it. Who are you to even question this? It's heresy.
There's also the component of, when I was a soldier, I had to run my 3 miles. You have to run your 3 miles. Why should I give you the easy way out? And like it's all boiled down to that. And another thing, when we talk about the culture of strength and conditioning, some coaches use conditioning as punishment, and that's a problem. So let's say one athlete misses the free throw, and because the team was having a bad practice, now the coach tells the strength coach, you have to make them run as punishment. Or worse, half the team runs, half the team doesn't. Now you're using a very specific appropriation of conditioning, and you're making it generic punishment that's throwing off all of the research that you're trying to do. When we're looking at a sport, like we talked about, we're essentially researching how to best train our athletes. Now you're taking that research and saying, well, the conditioning you're doing is fine, but they need to be punished. So they're going to run. They're going to do something that's not specific to the sport, just to send them a message. And I think that's a big problem. I've seen that a lot.
Yeah, so not only are you making your athletes dislike conditioning and training, which, if anything, you want them to love that stuff. So not only are you making them dislike what they're doing, you're also now completely potentially ruining the way they're being trained by training different energy systems. So, if an athlete is more of a fossil energy system based athlete and you make him go run 5 miles for punishment, the coach unknowingly is not only diminishing his chances of, winning future games by mistraining his athletes, he's also mentally creating an issue, making them not want to participate in certain types of training. Many athletes don't like strength and conditioning, unfortunately. Which to me, when I first started thinking about that, or hearing that from athletes, it was a little bit mind-blowing. Because again, I'd gotten into strength and conditioning before I got into athletics. For me, it was the opposite. I liked training, and that's what got me into track and pole vaulting. But for many athletes that love playing soccer or love playing volleyball or whatever it is, they like their sport. They don't like the work that has to go into it. And to be honest, I don't blame many of them, because many of the coaches that have done their strength and conditioning, again, have used methods such as punishment, or have just done workouts that were unrelated to their sport. Coaches just getting too stuck in the mindset of what they think they're supposed to be doing. They're getting too caught up in the name. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, so my job is to strengthen and condition. But it's so much more than that. It's really about improving the athlete and doing what those athletes really need to be the best athlete they can. And when I say that, I don't just mean sport-specific training, okay? Because that's another misconception. Some coaches get too caught up in the very specifics of training an athlete. And this is sometimes where I actually think that having a strength and conditioning coach working with a particular team, when that coach has never participated in that sport, at least not at a high level, can actually be beneficial. Because again, you get a former swimmer who is now working as the strength and conditioning coach for the swim team, and all they're doing is very specific swimming-based movements. Now you're setting your athlete up for potential injury or the creation of a muscular postural imbalance. Many athletes, at least for me, I can look at an individual and many times determine what kind of athlete they are by looking at their bodies. Many times they're imbalances. Many sports have a great effect on the athlete's body, and you can actually take a look at that body, and again, the body tells a story. How the athlete moves, how they stand, their posture, where their shoulders sit, how their spine either bends, rounds, or doesn't round, the positioning of their head and neck, the stance of their feet, the width, the point of the toes. These are all things that can kind of give clues to the kind of sports this individual has participated in or what they've done for their profession. And I think it's important to, as a strength and conditioning coach, we're trying to neutralize the athlete a little bit sometimes. They're doing so much repetitive movement, they don't need more training to compile on that movement. We can do some, don't get me wrong, there's movements and exercises that will help with those, but at the same time, we want to try to balance the athlete out. Keep them healthy, keep them functioning, because if these imbalances go too far, even if they're beneficial to some degree, taken to an extreme, they can be very detrimental and end up in a career-ending injury.
And you also have to look at the amount of repetition, like you said. So an athlete is doing a 3-hour practice, then they're being pushed sometimes by coaches who are so ingrained in, I have to make them better at the sport, have to work the sport motions, not understanding that they're getting 3 hours of the sport motion another part of the day. So it's like a football coach a football strength coach, I should say, who wants to run the athletes a lot for conditioning. Maybe it's good conditioning, but they're running, they're cutting, they're jumping. All of that movement is taking a toll on the body. It's taking a toll on the joints, and compounded with the actual football practice, or any sport you want to say, the actual practice, plus you have to understand a lot of the athletes are not getting the proper nutrition. And that's due to a lot of reasons. I don't know if we want to.
Well, that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, I don't think we'll get into it. But so a lack of recovery, a lot of times a lack of sleep, lack of nutrition, plus overworking the patterns that they're using in the sport could oftentimes lead to a problem. I know you said everybody has a story. I don't know if you took that from that ad campaign. There's a specific ad campaign now. It's everybody has a story.
No.
Okay. I figured you were giving a free plug on the podcast, But yeah, it's a big issue now, and that's why strength and conditioning is such a fascinating field, because there's so many considerations. When you talk to a doctor, there's pretty much a standard operating procedure for how a doctor goes about assessing and goes about treatment and goes about surgery. But in strength and conditioning, it's very wide open. A lot of that is because there's many different perspectives. I know, Mark, you're big into looking at other cultures and the development of training and martial arts through generations and generations. So we're taking influence from those cultures. Now we're mixing it with the latest scientific research and rationale, and we get a situation where there's a lot that can go right to benefit an athlete, but there's also a lot that can go off the rails.
That's very true. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things that are influencing these athletes. A lot of things that affect them, and over the course of time, anything that happens to this athlete or is done can really affect where they're going and how they're ultimately operating. So, all things definitely to consider. It's something that we sometimes forget when it comes to, sports-specific stuff. There's levels of training. There's different performance pyramids out there. I've kind of come up with my own concept of a performance pyramid. I call it Strength Coach Friedman's training pyramid. And ultimately, at the baseline, I call it vitality. And that really ties in with functionality, mobility, flexibility, health, and more of these baseline concepts that are a little bit more generic to a variety of sports. However, we will tailor them to the particular athlete, particular sport. And then building on that, I call that next phase vigor. And that next phase deals with strength, power, conditioning, acceleration, deceleration, bone density, resilience, size, durability, and a variety of other aspects. But that kind of ties more in with resistance training and the different training methods that would be done by the strength conditioning coach. So these first two steps are really what the strength and conditioning coach does. The third phase, the next level on this pyramid, gets more narrow, ties in with skills. And this starts talking more about the sport-specific skills that need to be worked with these athletes. But now this is where the head coach starts to take over. Okay, there's kind of an integration phase, but this is what the head coach really does. Head coach focuses on sports skills. So the strength and conditioning coach might work on hip mobility for a soccer player so that they can mobilize and move well on the field without having some kind of overextension injury like an ACL tear. Work on the strength and power so that they can move explosively, they can cut, they have good agility. Those are the elements of the strength and conditioning coach. But then when you're dealing with the specific ball handling skills, certain plays, that's what comes in with the coach. And then the fourth level that I think is really talked about by strength and conditioning coaches, because it really doesn't pertain to us. Again, it's more the head coach strategy. Strategy is a huge component of sports that I think sometimes people forget. It's not just about strength, power, and skill. It's about strategy. Look at football. It's almost like a real-time chess game. You have all these players, that can do different things, and it's how you utilize them, combine them, and allow that to overcome the opposing team. So strategy, I think, is really an important part. You could be a great athlete, and you can have all the elements of a great athlete, but if you're lacking in your strategy, right there, that can be a big issue. So we've touched upon a bunch of different things regarding strength and conditioning, coaches, how the coaches and the strength and conditioning coach can kind of work together or not work together in some unfortunate instances. But we could I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other elements of exercise physiology and kind of where people kind of draw this information from. So an interesting thing I want to talk about is the burpee exercise. Everyone's always going on about burpees. Burpees are great to get your heart rate up. They do all this good stuff. But is the burpee really a good exercise? And really, what is it and why do we do it? So, Louie, what are your takes on the exercise of a burpee?
I believe the burpee is one of the most overused and most incorrect exercises there is. And if you look at the individual components of a burpee, essentially you're moving into, when you're in the push-up position, whether you're doing the push-up or just getting to that plank position, you're in an anti-extension position. Whether it's very briefly or for longer, depending on the fitness level of the person doing it, you're working on anti-extension, then you're working on a chest movement if you're adding the push-up to it, then moving to a rapid hip hinge to an explosive jump. So you might look at a burpee and say, well, a burpee is almost a low-level version of an Olympic lift in terms of hip hinge and explosiveness. Mm-hmm. It would make sense. But the actual biomechanics of the burpee, when you look at the limb length of most people, look at the femur lengths, the length of the arms, the flexibility in the lumbar spine, in the quadratus lumborum area, in the ability to get the hips underneath with proper foot and ankle position, it just leads to a whole host of problems. A lot of times you're adding a jump to that as well. So you're adding a ballistic component to a movement that's probably compromised either by just the simple biomechanics of the person doing it or the lack of flexibility and fitness level. So it kind of cycles back to what we were talking about right in the beginning. Why are we doing a burpee? The way I've seen, and I've worked a lot in the personal training and fitness sector, it seems to be an exercise that's done as a conditioning drill to get somebody moving and to make them sweat. But why not take all of those components and work them not in isolation, but more disparately? We work on accepting the force of a jump. Remember, anytime somebody jumps up, they have to land. But if they can't land properly, then you're putting them at risk. So in order to take the risk away...
People don't get hurt jumping. People get hurt landing.
Exactly. So one of the ways we could take the risk out of a jump that what somebody would do in a burpee when they land off the jump is to teach them how to land. So if we teach them how to land, we teach them how to jump, we teach them how to jump with velocity, and then we use techniques like, without getting too specific, I don't want to use too many concepts, but we can use potentiation. Have somebody do a heavy lift, then bring them over to the jump. Now the person's recruiting more fibers, more motor units. Then they can jump higher. So we took one part of that burpee exercise and we made it more powerful and more efficient and safer. And I believe we could do that for all of the components. We work on anti-extension drills. We can work on anti-extension with force, and we can do that in a safe manner. We can take hip hinging and essentially the mechanics of an Olympic lift. We could teach somebody in a safe way. We could start with clean pulls. We could give them dumbbell clean, dumbbell snatch, something that's low load. Then we can move them up. So while the burpee itself, I don't believe sets the body in a proper position or an education in order to perform properly, if we take each element of it, work them in isolation, and make each part of the motion efficient, we've essentially made the burpee redundant. We've made it redundant, and we've exposed it as an exercise that's not quite as safe as what you would believe based on the types of people and the amount of people that are being put in that situation.
I agree fully. I was talking to a physical therapist once, and he said he loves the thing. It's great for business. He said it sounds like a great way to herniate the lumbar spine. And it's just funny how some of these things get brought up because most people don't even know why they're doing burpees. You ask a trainer, they're like, yeah, it's great for the heart rate. But they've done research on this, and they've kind of looked into this a little bit, and it's elevating your heart rate to some degree, not because it's great exercise, but because you're changing the position of your body. Anytime you go from a standing position, from a vertical to a horizontal position, it changes the way your heart has to pump blood. So to rapidly do this can lead to some of the dizziness or nausea or changes in heart rate that some people now are thinking is elevated heart rate due to good training. When in reality, it's I forgot the name of the specific effect, but of the effect of changing this position. And the funny thing is that the burpee was never even meant to be a training exercise. The burpee was an exercise or a movement that was created by this guy Burpee. I believe his name was Royal Huddleston Burpee. And he was actually a physiologist, and he wrote his PhD on this burpee exercise and using it as a testing method. It wasn't meant to be an exercise. It was a testing tool to look at, I guess, aerobic capacity. However, the burpee that was defined back then is nothing like the burpee of today. At the time, it was supposed to be done slowly at 4 counts, where you would start standing, you would come into a proper squatting position, place your hands on the floor, kick the legs out, and you would go into a perfect straight arm plank position. Where most people, if you watch burpees today, their hips sag, their chest is touching the ground, they're doing push-ups, they're overarching their lumbar spine, which is furthering an anterior pelvic tilt and causing damage to the discs of the lumbar spine. None of this was defined by Burpee himself. Again, it was standing to a squat, which are both fine movements, standing with good posture, squatting, and then jumping into a plank position Nothing wrong with that. And then you would return, but this would be done at a slow pace, at a constant tempo. It wasn't supposed to be do 50 as fast as you can or until you throw up, as many people are now using it today.
I believe the same thing happened with the Tabata. Tabata
Absolutely.
was originally a research test.
Yeah.
I know you've studied this a lot, but now you hear on Instagram and YouTube, you watch videos, oh, I did a Tabata this and a Tabata that.
Tabata didn't create that workout.
Exactly.
Tabata I believe he's still alive today. I don't think the paper was written that long ago. But he was a Japanese, I guess he was an exercise physiologist, who created this method, or it wasn't a method, it was a test. It was a research paper when he was trying to look at cyclists. This is supposed to be geared for Olympic or just professional level cyclists. Granted, a lot of these guys were juicing at the time, so that kind of varies things. And that's where the whole time frame came from. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with training for those durations of time, doing an interval style training that lasts for up to 20. I think his was 20 minutes, but there's nothing wrong with that. But that was supposed to be done for cycling. It wasn't necessarily supposed to be done with all these explosive movements. You're not supposed to be using plyometrics or burpees or all these different things that are not meant for aerobic training, or really any energy system training. It's more for training explosiveness for these kinds of exercises. So it's kind of interesting how, again, someone probably read this paper, thought the results sounded cool, and just said, hey, let me just adapt this research study into a training method. But, that's not necessarily the best way training methods should be created. I'm all for looking at studies and seeing what they yield, but I wouldn't necessarily, just replicate a study and do that for training. Look what happened, in the study that was done by John Ivey with the basketball players that I mentioned earlier. That was not the ideal way to train basketball players. But someone could very easily look at that and say, oh, wow, they had these, they just read the abstract or just read the conclusion. They say, oh, okay, let's get these basketball players running distance because he did it. But that was to show that it was ineffective, So again, we need to be careful of where we get our information from and what it is. If you just hear about something, don't just do it. Just because you saw it on TV or your friend did it, or you saw someone doing it at the gym, or you saw it on YouTube, it doesn't mean that you should just do this type of training without looking into it. You don't just walk into your friend's bathroom, open the medicine cabinet, and start taking pills. Why? Why would you do that? If you don't even know what the pill does, why are you going to take it? If you don't know what an exercise does or a training program does, why are you just going to do it? To me, it doesn't make sense. But it seems today, now we're kind of talking a little bit more about mainstream fitness culture, people aren't doing what fits their goal. They don't sit there and go, okay, my goal is to lose 20 pounds. What is the best way to lose 20 pounds with my given body, my fitness experience, my age, my previous injuries? What would be the best program for me to follow? Instead, they just think, well, I'm just going to push hard. If I'm sweating a lot, if I'm out of breath, if I'm feeling sore the next day, then I'm working hard, and that's going to make me lose the weight. You can do workouts that have nothing to do really with weight loss. You can do, 1 repetition maximums on the bench press, squat, and deadlift. That's not really going to be ideal for helping you lose weight. Are you going to be sore? Are you going to be fatigued? Is it quite possible you're going to puke? Very possible. But that objective, that type of training is not geared towards your result. So again, and this happens in strength and conditioning all the time. Coaches come up with a method, they think it's tough. Oh, they're football players, they're tough. Let's do up downs for 2 hours. But how is that really improving the ability of a football player? Football players don't do burpees on the field. Granted, sometimes they have to get up and down, but not in that session. If you have to tackle a person, every so many plays, well then that's how the training should be set, and not jumping down the ground every 2 seconds if it's not something you'd actually do in the sport. Thoughts, Louie?
It's you're opening up a can of worms.
Oh,
you're opening up a can of worms.
I opened the cans of worms.
See, now the training you discussed could possibly work.
It could.
I mean, it could, but we know that there are more effective ways. So if somebody's doing 1 repetition maximum and they change their diet, they might very well lose weight.
That's very
true.
true.
And they might say it works.
A huge part of weight loss is based on diet rather than just what you're doing in the gym. So
the other thing too is a lot of people feel that if an exercise is difficult, I apologize for the phone, if the exercise is difficult, it's automatically good or it's viewed as being effective.
Yeah.
Any trainer, I could take anybody off the street.
You can take anyone off the street and have them do burpees. And I always say this, I could take my 6-year-old cousin, right, give him a whistle, all right, and tell him, all right, every time you blow this whistle, I'm going to give you a quarter. I want you to blow this whistle as many times as possible. I could turn to a client and say, hey, every time you hear that whistle blow, I want you to do a burpee. And I can walk away for half an hour, okay, go to Starbucks, come back, and that guy's going to be laying on the floor because he's had to do, 1,000 burpees in the last 30 minutes. Is that necessarily good training? In the minds of many people, it very well may be because they were exhausted, because their heart rate was up, they were sweating, maybe they threw up. For some people, puking, the puke index is the measure of a good workout. But in my personal opinion, just having someone do burpees for 30 minutes might not be what they really need to achieve the goals they want to achieve. If their goal is to simply do as many burpees as they can in 30 minutes, and that's what their whole life is about, well then go for it. But if that's not your main goal, and I haven't met a person yet whose goal that was, having a different system, a different methodology to your training might be a little bit better.
I agree. And I know this is a strength podcast, so when we're talking about strength, remember, we want our athletes to maintain efficiency. We never want inefficiency. And a lot of these cardio-based exercises, these high-intensity methods of essentially burning the players out, is reinforcing inefficiency. Would you say you agree with that?
Absolutely.
To an extent?
Depends on the type of training. Conditioning's absolutely a component, but just to burn people out for the heck of, just for the sake of tiring them out, why? What's the purpose? One of the biggest struggles when training, athletes at the collegiate level, for instance, they're students. Many of them are full-time students. They have schoolwork to do, classes to attend, and the strength and conditioning coach only has so many hours with them to actually train. That time is so valuable. I don't like wasting my time with the people that I train. If I'm going to be doing something with an athlete or soldier, I want to be doing something of substance. With my previous job when I was working for the military, many of these soldiers only had so much time to train. I had to make their programs as efficient as possible. I didn't want to waste time. I didn't want them doing hours and hours a day of training. They didn't have the time for it. So you have to really sometimes, there's theoretically what's great and then also what's practically feasible. So I always look at feasibility. Maybe I'll define what's the ideal, theoretical concept, and from there I cut away. I bring it down sometimes more to the bare bones. Again, if you only have so much time with your athlete, why focus on generic things that are really not going to benefit them in the long run? Don't forget your goal. Your goal as a strength and conditioning coach is not to exhaust an athlete. It's not to tire them. It's to make them better athletes. If what you're doing is making them better, why are you doing it?
It all comes back to purpose. It's what we talked about before. So if the purpose is there, then there's no time wasted because everything has a purpose. Unless something has more of a purpose than something else. If something's more important, then that's what you have to focus on. But you want to try to get everything in. I work with people now. I work with a few clients, half-hour sessions. If you're working in a half-hour session and you're only seeing them once or twice a week, you have to use every minute of that time. It has to be efficient training, and it has to fully utilize everything they need in a given time frame. There's no wasted time. There's no room for throwing an exercise at a client because it looked cool on the internet, that you don't understand how it works, but it looks good and it makes them sweat. That's not the objective. The objective, and this is whether you're a strength and conditioning coach, you're a personal trainer, anything in this industry, your goal is to create purpose, physical purpose. The mental stuff, that's something different. But when you're training somebody and you're prescribing exercises, you're prescribing corrective functional movements, you're prescribing flexibility movements and performing flexibility screens, everything has to be for a reason. So if there's one thing I believe coaches can take away, at least from this podcast, it's to understand the purpose of what you're doing. And if you don't, please learn it. Listen to resources like Mark. Learn this information. And I know you're looking at creating an entire curriculum based on this, correct? I know you talked about the pyramid before.
Well, one of my long-term goals, I guess back up a little bit. I tend to view training as a subject matter. You know, training, although today we sadly our fitness industry looks at everything as a quick fix. Hey, try this 4-week program, try this 8-week program, this booty shredder, ab builder, whatever, bikini lifter workout. And we're bombarded, constantly with these short-term programs that are not really designed for anyone in particular. They're very generic. And then once you complete that program, it's like, oh, well, I did that for 8 weeks. Now what do I do? And they jump on the next program. If you look at our educational system in the United States, granted, we don't have the greatest educational system, but we are doing okay in the long run. There's a philosophy, there's a system to how we educate people. When you start off math, for instance, you don't just go in on the first day of kindergarten, hey guys, we're doing trigonometry. It doesn't work like that. We don't just randomly teach different subject matter in the field of mathematics or any subject. There's a system, there's a learning curve. When we learn math, we first need to learn the very concept of numbers, to count. We need to be able to count numbers. From there, we can learn how to, what these numbers are a theoretical concept, but we learn how to utilize them or understand what we can do with them, what these representations, these symbols mean. We can add them together. We can subtract them. Then we learn how to divide and multiply. We understand the concept of fractions and decimals, etc., etc. So training really, and back in the day, we actually had a great physical training program, in the public schools. Physical education was a real education. Now kids go in, they touch their toes, they do a couple stretches, they count to 10, they run around for 20 minutes, they throw some dodgeballs, and then they're done. Half the time, well, not half the time, but some days they don't even do exercise in gym. Sometimes the gym teacher doesn't want to do something, or they can't go outside, whatever it is. The kids are playing their Game Boys, or they're canceling gym to make room for other activities. So physical health in our country has become, it's kind of this dualistic thing now. Everyone's just overly obsessed with health. All we're talking about is the issues of smoking, obesity, all these different ailments and illnesses. Everyone's crazy about healthcare, and that's a huge major thing that we're talking about in our society right now. Yet, we're doing nothing to prevent any of these issues. We're not instilling proper physical training regimens with kids from a young age that would ultimately prevent many of the preventable illnesses. We're totally not taking that into consideration. So what I would like to do is ultimately create an at least to work with the people I train, but I would love to implement this eventually into the public school system in the United States, a real physical education training system. And I've been thinking about this for a while. I've actually had some clients that were gym teachers at elementary schools, and I started kind of giving them things to do with their kids in a more systematic way. I'm not saying the whole, the kids still, you want them to have fun in gym and enjoy exercise, but very easily you can put together a long-term program, a fitness program that to get people doing training over a period of time. And granted, you can create different programs. And the struggle with this is, and I think the reason why it doesn't happen is because you don't want to create too generic of a program. When you have older individuals, especially athletes, you only have so much time. You need to adapt the program to what they need to do. So rather than just at the younger level, when you're a kid, when you're in grade school, 5 years old to 18 years old, I think you can have more of a curriculum, and then that can be adapted to meet the needs of the individuals. As you get to higher levels of athletics, clearly you're going to need to have more specified programs for these individuals. But at least from a philosophical standpoint, it's not bad to think about training long term. So when I've trained different individuals, I'm not just thinking, okay, what are we doing the next 4 weeks? I'm thinking, what are your short-term goals? What are your medium-term goals? And what are your long-term goals? Coaches should be thinking long-term. If you're a strength and conditioning coach for a university, okay, these athletes are usually there for 4 years, okay, unless they drop out, transfer, etc. But in general, you're going to be working with these athletes for 4 years. Should you really be doing the same exact training program every single year with the same athletes? Probably not, because it's like you're getting them to a certain level and then having them repeat what they already did. So to some degree, there should be continuous progression with training. That's the very concept of training, or one of the main concepts, progressive overload. Training, I always say, what is training? Most people, you ask them what is training, they don't know. Even trainers and coaches, it's making people stronger, it's working them out, making them sweat. Those are all results of training, but that's not training itself. Training, at the simplest definition that I can give, is simply stress and adaptation. That's what training is. We stress a system of the body, we stress a component of the body, and then we allow that system to recover, and in that recovery process, it adapts to that specific stimuli and becomes better at dealing with that stimuli in the future. That's what training is. When we create this training, we want this training to be progressive. We want a progressive overload. We want these athletes to continuously be building, not backtrack. So as long as you're progressing in a healthy manner, athletes aren't being injured, they can continue to progress. So for that 4 years of working with a collegiate athlete, your training program should progress as these athletes continue to progress, age, and mature.
Absolutely. They should be progressing, but that's not the way it's treated in a lot of schools. Think about that. You have 4 years. 4 years to make a real difference. And I don't mean that in some, kumbaya, holding hands kind of make a difference, but in terms of the physiology of the body, the response that you'll get from the training, the efficiency of the musculoskeletal system to produce force, you can make tremendous strides in an athlete in 4 years. Obviously, they'd have to buy into your system. The head coach has to stand their ground and understand that you're the professional. It's kind of what we talked about before. But and this doesn't even stop at 4 years. I believe the training that you impart upon somebody should last the rest of their life. Absolutely. I mean, it should be a lifelong consideration. Now, one thing that was interesting that you mentioned, I believe if you take the students, the children, and you start them off, you would get by the age of 18 a more homogeneous group of young adults
fit, yep,
who are more at a certain level of function that you can then specify them. The problem we have now is we're not accounting for any of this. So students are growing up, hopefully they're playing sports. Some people don't play sports, but they're not receiving an education. So without the education in movement and the education in producing force, then they become adults, they become middle-aged adults, they become seniors, and you see the manifestation of so many problems that could have been solved, could have been accounted for, or maybe prevented completely if you had put them on a progressive system from a young age and moved them through to adulthood. So if you're looking for the biggest area of growth in this field, I believe it's the children. If we can impart our strategies on the youth, once they're adults, they're so much better off. And this has so many benefits. Healthcare costs would drop.
Absolutely.
Less visits to the doctor's
Oh,
office.
yeah.
It would do so much good. But for those of you listening, as coaches, as trainers, this is our prerogative. This is what we have to be. We have to be the advocates of this information. We have to put it out there. Be the microphone for everything that we're talking about. Because the more people we can reach with this information, the better off the entire population will be.
Yeah, the whole society. And it's so funny how many of these things are kind of socially constructed. You know, when I've spent time abroad, I spent some time living with some indigenous people in Indonesia, and you know, there was this 84-year-old shaman, and this guy could go into a full squat better than I could. At 84 years old, he was squatting. He could sit in a squat for 20 minutes, smoke a couple cigarettes, eat his meal. This guy was wearing a pair of flip-flops and hiking through the forest that was kicking my ass, you know, with my fancy boots and everything, because he's been doing it his whole life. Far too often we hear things like, oh, kids shouldn't be doing training. You know, kids can't train. We'll let them play baseball. We'll let them, you know, throw, you know, pitch multiple innings at 11 years old to the point the kid has tendinitis in his shoulder, but we'll tell them that doing strength and conditioning is bad. And it's not. And they've done so much research now, they've actually found that young children, the youngest age group they've done strength and conditioning studies with that I know of, or at least at the time when I was doing this research, was 6-year-olds. And they actually noticed these 6-year-old kids had the greatest gains in strength, more than twice as much as, 2 to 3 times as much actually, as adults had in similar studies. Children, because much of strength is neuromuscular. You know, it's coming from the brain, it's the nervous system. It's not all muscle size. But they were having some of the greatest improvements in strength from a young age. And again, you look at other societies, they don't have these same health issues or movement issues. I'm so tired, unfortunately, of hearing, you know, people, or especially the medical industry, telling people, oh, it's okay that your knees hurt, it's old age. You know, 80-year-old, you know, they're going to buy it, but I'm hearing people, they're 35 years old, and the doctors are telling them, your knees aren't working because of old age. But then when I actually do my strength and conditioning evaluations with these individuals, it's nothing to do with their knees. Their knees are hurting them because of all the other problems in their body that are causing them to misuse their knee, and it's generating improper forces in the knee, and that's what's leading to the arthritis of a 35-year-old individual. That guy's not degenerating in 35 years when the shaman's been working and walking and hiking his entire life for 84 years and has no problems in his lower body.
I believe there's an assumption amongst most people, most general people that you'd find on the street, would tell you that the body functions as it should, that the body knows how to function, it knows how to move itself, so therefore any problems like the knee issues, it must just be going bad because the body, my knee knows how to flex and extend, I know how to move my shoulder up and down, but what we don't understand is that the genetic basis that we're working with was essentially meant for a totally different lifestyle. Exactly. Whatever you believe about whether this was evolution, whether we were designed this way, it's really irrelevant. The body is a system that was designed for used for its intended purpose of hunting, gathering, storing energy, taking food that it could get and storing it. So now we're in a society where we don't hunt, we don't gather, and we have an absolute...
You sit around all day.
Exactly, and food is not a scarcity by any measure. So a lot of the problems are due to the conflict between what the body does naturally and what the lifestyle is providing it. I think that's one of the big problems. So when we hear the terms corrective exercise and functional movement, it's almost a restoration. Think about it as restoring the natural function, restoring the balance of the body that we have and the way we're treating it. So one of my big issues is trying to get my athletes and clients to understand that maintenance and restoration is an important factor in their life, just in general. So doing things like myofascial release, flexibility routines, resistance training, conditioning, all of this is not only for performance outcome, but it's for restoration. When we're students and we're sitting in school, physical education, if they didn't cut it out of the school already, is a very, very small part of a long day of sitting down. Obviously, education is a wonderful thing, but it's just the unfortunate nature of the society we live in, that we sit so much, we're placed in bad biomechanical positions, the body becomes efficient at those positions, which means it becomes less efficient at something else. There's always a give and take. So that's something else, yeah.
Yeah, we've gotten really good at sitting, Louie. Although
that's an easy way to say what I just said in 1,000 words.
And unfortunately, the human body is not even meant to sit. The engagement of the muscles or lack of engagement of the muscles through sitting is no good. It's really impossible. People always say, sit with good posture. I personally have come to the conclusion it's impossible to sit with good posture, because to some degree you're trying to force yourself into some position. Your hips are most likely going to be in an anterior pelvic tilt unless you're slouching. Then you're in a posterior pelvic tilt, and you're just creating all these spinal problems. So many people, they get up from sitting and they're like, oh yeah, this hurts. Yeah, because we're not supposed to be sitting. Squatting is the resting position for most people, and again, it's a cultural thing. You go to, I've been in Vietnam, I've been in Indonesia, I've been in a lot of places where they don't sit, they squat. The village I was in Borneo, there were no chairs, there were no tables, there were no couches, they didn't even have high toilets. So, if you were 80-something years old, if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to squat. If you would take a dump, you were squatting. There was no way around it. And these people did it, and they kept doing it, and they can still do it. So, it's so fascinating how so much of this kind of stuff, many of the issues that we have in our society, we created for ourselves. And at the end of the day, I shooting myself in the foot here, but my job shouldn't exist. The idea of even needing trainers and strength and conditioning coaches is kind of ludicrous. If you were to look back to early humans, they'd probably almost laugh. Granted, they had people that specialize in this even in ancient Greece and Rome, but people were just at such a higher level of physical capability to begin with. They were doing more training. Many times I feel like I get individuals, and I'm starting from scratch. It's like everything they've been doing their whole life has been screwing them up, and I need to fix all these things I'm working in the negative. They get me there in a negative place. I got to get them to neutral before I can even take them above that.
And remember too, neutral is possibly the starting point for a lot of these trendy exercises that people are throwing. So maybe an exercise has merit, but it doesn't have merit for everybody. And that's one of the problems I see in personal training. Trainers find new exercises. For variety's sake, they then provide these exercises to clients who are not even at that neutral level that their body could take that force, take those positions. I'll give you a more practical example. Overhead pressing. There's a whole debate on overhead pressing. Some people say never overhead press. Some people say, overhead pressing is fine. I believe, and I think you would agree with me, that it all depends. What's the range of motion in the shoulder? What does the scapula look like? Because the scapula is important to overhead function as well.
It's huge.
Is the scapula moving? How are the hips set? Once these conditions are accounted for, then you can safely overhead press. But if you don't meet these criteria, then it's not a good thing. There's a lot of overgeneralization of things. You should never squat below parallel. Well, that kind of depends, doesn't it?
Who are you? What's the length of your femur? What's your mobility?
What does the ankle look like? There's a lot of discerning here, and that's why assessment is really important. If you can take an athlete, take a client, assess them, understand their possibilities, and then also be cognizant of their limitations, then we can get to work them through that place where then they can do everything without restriction. But that's a process. Like you said, you have to get them from negative to zero before you can pump them up. And if you pump them up too quickly, a lot of times that results in injuries, and improper movement patterns. Because if the body can't do a movement and you're forcing the body to do that movement, it will do that movement by finding another way to get it done.
Yep.
A lot of times that's through compensation.
And energy leaks.
Energy leaks and compensation. And remember, we want to be efficient. So if we're leaking energy, it's like you build a big tower, a skyscraper, and you build it on a wood foundation. Well, that's a weak link. That's your compensation. In order to save costs, instead of having the $1 billion, what's the building in Dubai? I don't remember the name. But you want to save on a little bit of construction costs. Oh, let's build it on a wood foundation. But something has to give. And when something does give, there's your orthopedic surgeon ready to go.
Oh, yeah, they love it. But at the end of the day, I think we'll wrap up here. At the end of the day, what is a strength and conditioning coach? And strength and conditioning coach is a lot of things. Strength and conditioning coach has to be part artist, part coach, part philosopher, part psychologist. There's so many components, part scientist, to what a strength and conditioning coach is. But at the end of the day, we need to remind ourselves that our job is to improve an athlete's ability to perform on the field, minimize their risk of injury. And many times, the way to accomplish this is just like Louie said, identify and correct the weak link. You don't need your basketball player benching 600 pounds to be a better basketball player. Maybe if everything else he's doing is already so great that being able to bench 600 pounds is going to make him better, well then do it. But I think in most circumstances, basketball players aren't benching 600 pounds. I don't think LeBron benches 600 pounds. I don't think Michael Jordan benches 600 pounds. And these are some of the top basketball players of all time. I don't even think Shaq was benching 600, but don't quote me on that. I don't know what he was benching. He was a pretty big guy. But ultimately, what we need to do as coaches, we need to find the weak links. What is stopping an athlete? What is preventing an athlete from being the best they can be? What is creating the greatest risk for an injury of an athlete? You can be the greatest athlete in the world, but if you're injured and you're sitting on the bench, you're worthless, unfortunately, for that team and at the time. So always consider, I think if you get anything out of this podcast, I know we've been rambling for a little while, remember what is your purpose as a coach and what is the purpose that your athlete needs to fulfill, and figure out what is preventing them from achieving that purpose and eliminate. That is your first thing to do. So if it's flexibility, if it's strength, if it's aerobic capacity, or some other form of conditioning, find out what that is and target it. And you will be surprised at how much your athletes improve. Sometimes it's, I'm a pitcher, but my shoulder hurts. Well, you don't need to work on your bench press. You need to work on getting your shoulder feeling better so you can actually throw. And I've had several baseball players that I've worked with that have had those issues. And simply by getting them past the pain, they were afraid to throw. And once they were feeling better and they actually saw how training helped them, they were in the gym multiple days a week. They felt stronger than ever before. And they were excited to get back to their sport. And that's really, at the end of the day, yeah, we need to motivate people. But just simply yelling and screaming and shouting are not always the best ways of motivating people. I'm not saying you can't do it, but sometimes getting them to find an intrinsic motivation can be your best way of actually motivating an athlete and accomplishing your goal and as a strength and conditioning coach.
I agree. Meet them where they are, not where you are. Remember that. So you get a new athlete, get a new client, understand their situation. Understand what motivates them. Why does it motivate them? Once you had those answers, then you can reach them. Once you get them, once you reach them and you get them to buy into your system, then the possibilities are limitless because they trust you. They're willing to put up with the exercises that they might not want to do because they understand that they're correcting weak links to make themselves better. And then training becomes fun from there because then you can do all the awesome things that you see on YouTube.
Well, maybe not burpees.
Not burpees. No.
Well, Louie, it's always a pleasure conversing with you and discussing matters in strength and conditioning. And thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. And again, I hope we can we'll be able to put out some future podcasts with you and the two of us chatting about strength and conditioning.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on the show, and I look forward to hearing your future content and possibly being a guest again.
Awesome. Thanks, Louie. And this is Strength Coach Friedman. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.